I'm David Nicholson, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Prince Lab at Emory. Let me start off by acknowledging people. So this is the team that I'm on. We're part of a big DARPA project that's trying to develop these continual machine learning algorithms. We're the Lifelong Learning Machines program, and we're the Atlanteans because we're in Atlanta. It's my advisor, Astrid Prince, who's really great. And at some point I have to move on, so if you're interested in doing this, come find me. But sort of the takeaway from this, we're a neuroscience lab, right? I hope that you'll get from this, one thing is that this work has kind of fed back into neuroscience, and in particular because it's really easy to build these tools, or these models now with tools like Tensorflow and the entire scientific Python stack. So I use all the libraries, thank you. Including Pygame. I don't know if maybe this is the first. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. I don't know if this is the first SciPy talk to acknowledge Pygame, but it's been useful for me, as I hope you'll see. So when I, as a neuroscientist, say visual search, I'm sort of thinking out in the real world of something like this, like I want to find my car keys on a cluttered desk, right? But in the lab, we often historically have used stimuli that look kind of like this. I'll talk more about these in a second. But the big point here is that we're measuring behavior. So we'll do some task like the one I'm about to tell you about, and we'll try to measure behavior and infer the mechanisms in the brain for something like goal-driven perception. How do I do visual search? And if I build a good model of the brain, I can measure my model's behavior. And if I measure the behavior well, then I can figure out if my model and my mechanism does what I think it does. And by extension, I could cut and paste that mechanism into my artificial intelligence agents and then measure its behavior and figure out if I made something that's like a human or other animals. Right? So, and just think about, and we can talk about this more at the end if people have questions, this sort of how much behavior matters here and how good a job we do of measuring it and what the behavior is in the real world versus the task we use to try to measure our models. So here's this task. I'll call it the discrete item display visual search task. It doesn't have a real name in the literature, I don't think, but I'm calling it that because as you can see, there's these displays, these stimuli you show to the subject, and you ask them to report whether the target is present or absent. So on the top row, the target is absent, and then on the bottom row, it's present. So these 6 images are each one of the displays that you would see. And then the other thing that the experimenter manipulates is the set size, right? So on the top row, the set size is 2. On the bottom, it's 4. And that's like the total number of targets and distractors. And then lastly, you're going to change the features of these stimuli that the subject we think is using to do the visual search, right? So on the left, the thing that discriminates the target from the distractor is just a single feature, right? The color, the target is red, like in that lower left square, and then the distractors are green. In the middle column, it's 2 features, so there's a conjunction, as it's called in the literature. So you're looking for something that is vertical and red. There's some distractors that are now red, but horizontal. And then finally on the right, this is a spatial configuration of features, right? So you have a digital 2, a digital 5. They're like a mirror image of each other. They're made up of these lines that have orientations. So now you have to try to bind all of those features together for each item. And so the behavior sort of depends on all of those factors that change. And then you're going to try to infer mechanisms about how the brain does the task. This is a cartoon of what the results look like. So there's 2 ways people have done this task. Some people will show the display to the subject and just wait until they respond and record the reaction time. And when you do this, what you see for the feature stimulus, like just red versus green, is that there's essentially no increase in reaction time as the number of distractors goes up, as the set size increases. But for the conjunction, there's some slight slope to that line. That's like the reaction time is a function of set size. And then the slope starts to get really steep for the spatial configuration. There's another way to do the task, which is to just flash the display briefly and then put up some masking white noise image. And the idea there is to try to control some of the factors you think might be conflating your results. So you want to prevent the subject from moving their eyes, for example. So you don't want to conflate those effects. So those people measure accuracy when they do the task that way, and qualitatively the results are similar. So for feature search, these feature stimuli, there's no dramatic drop in accuracy as the number of distractors increases. For the conjunction search, there's a more dramatic effect. There's a larger drop in accuracy. People haven't usually used the spatial configuration type stimuli for this, and I don't want to like get it down too much into the weeds of the details of these different ways of doing the task. But it matters because there's two different models, right? So they're trying to explain what they call capacity limitations. What are the factors that limit our ability to do this task? When people look at reaction time, they often have what they call serial attention limited mechanisms. So the idea there is there's some mechanism in the brain that binds these features together, and it's serial. It like takes time. So that's why the reaction time is increasing as there's more features to bind together. And people who are looking at accuracy often have these signal detection theory-based models. So they're saying, no, you can process everything in parallel. It's just about noise. So as the number of items goes up, there's more noise in this internal representation, and that's what's causing this drop in accuracy. And if you're asking yourself, like, wait, there's people doing two slightly different tasks with two slightly different models. Is that really, are they even getting at the same thing? I think that's a good thing to ask. But for now, I don't care about that. I just care about that this behavior replicates across experiments. So thousands of experiments have been done this way. We know that people will have this impairment in their behavior, for example, the accuracy drop. So I can do a sort of apples to apples comparison with this behavior and my behavior I would get out of a neural network. Right? And the reason I want to use that is because these models, you can make them computational, but none of them are pixels in, behavior out. So I can't just show them any image and then get out a behavior because of the way that they've often been represented. So instead, we'll go to neural networks. And when I say neural networks, I mean what you're thinking of and not what I think of as a neuroscientist. Right? So this thing that was connectionist models in the 1980s, and then GPUs suddenly made them useful. Right, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, here's a representation of a convolutional neural network, right, where you have these convolutional layers, you learn these kernels that act as sort of feature detectors and spit out these feature maps. And then as you train the network, it gets better and better at finding features that help it do something like image classification. And there's been a thread of work in the past few years that's compared these networks to the visual system in particular, like the primate visual system, which is probably the most studied brain region or system. So here's a cartoon version of AlexNet, which was sort of the first architecture that really showed that these convolutional neural networks could be state-of-the-art. You have these convolutional layers at the bottom, and then at the top, there's these fully connected layers. And you can map this onto, in a really high-level way, how we think about the visual system in the brain. So we think that there's some low-level feature detectors. They find edges and orientation. The mid-level features, we think, are something like texture or shape. And then by the time you get to the top, there's some high-level semantic representation. So we think that the brain is mapping from low-level feature space into a high-level semantic space. And this thread of work in the past few years has directly compared these networks with the brain. So here's one example where this is human subjects viewing images in fMRI. So this is like brain scanner activity. And they look at the correlation between lower levels in AlexNet with early visual areas. And they see the strongest correlation there. And then on the right, I'm showing you a higher level in AlexNet would be more correlated with a more higher area in the visual system, like further from the periphery. And the same thing holds true if you look at like electrophysiology data in the monkey brain. So you record single neurons with electrodes. And if you do this correlation type analysis again, you see that in this higher level monkey brain area, it seems to be most correlated with the higher levels in a neural network, in a convolutional neural network. So this presents a hypothesis. If the CNNs are truly learning representations that are similar to what we think we see in the brain, then we should be able to take the CNN, ask it to do a similar task, and get behavior that is like what humans do. And you can probably see where this is going. I could ask it to do the discrete item display search task, and I would expect it to have the same factors impair its accuracy the way that our accuracy is impaired. And there's at least one paper that has tried to do this with the convolutional neural networks I was just telling you about. This is Poder 2017, right? So I wanted to start here and replicate this work. And it's possible to do this fairly easily with TensorFlow. So I'm going to replicate specifically his training method. I'm going to take some weights that are pre-trained on ImageNet. So this is this big data set that people use as a benchmark. And AlexNet was first trained on ImageNet, and that's what showed that it could blow all the other models away. And then so I keep those weights, and then in the fully connected layers at the top, my semantic layers, I'm going to randomly initialize the weights, and then train them with a really small learning rate. So this is called fine-tuning, or you can think of it as transfer learning, right? So the idea of this with this transfer learning is I got some representation from one domain, and it should help me perform better in a related domain. The other layers, you could apply a really small learning rate. The rate that this author used was like non-existent, basically, but for replication purposes, as a good replicator, I used it. And then, thanks to Pygame, I was able to make very easily these visual search images, and I wanted my results to not depend on some sort of pre-processing that would like reshape the image. So I want to make them the exact same shape as the input to AlexNet, so I made a little Pygame library, search stims, that does that. And then lastly, I'll train a bunch of replicates to make sure my results don't depend on random initialization, and then, because I'm a good machine learning-ologist, I'll measure the accuracy on a separate test set that it's never seen before. And when I do that, I get some results like this that look qualitatively similar to what we see with human subjects, right? So there looks like a little bit of a slope for the feature search stimulus. Then for conjunction search, it's a bit steeper. And then when you get to spatial configuration, you see there's this real drop in accuracy for set size 8. And you can hear me being kind of wishy-washy because I'm going to tell you that this effect changes when I change the training. So I'm not going to go all the way and like fit slopes to this and then do some stats on it. Right, I showed this to our collaborator after sitting on it for a couple months, being like, oh man, these are just like the brain. And then our collaborator was like, nah, this network should be able to do this task. Like, just increase the learning rate. Look at the training history, and you'll see that it hasn't converged. And lo and behold, I did that, and our collaborator, who knows things about machine learning, was right, right? So you can see that set size 1, I split this out by the set size of the visual search stimulus. So set size 1 seems to have converged by the time we get to 800 epochs of training, but the other set sizes are still going up. And you notice that there's sort of a linear relation here, right, where set size 1 increased the fastest, and then you go down from there. So I'm going to change my training. I'm going to use a typical learning rate that you would use to train these networks. I'm going to freeze the weights in the other layers because I still want these representations to stay the same, right? I'm trying to test this hypothesis. And I'm going to increase the number of examples for the larger set sizes. So they seem in particular impaired in accuracy, so maybe it just helps if I augment the data set by making more examples. And when I look now at my training history, I see that, yeah, they've all seemed to have converged. But notice that there is still this little difference where a set size 8 takes longer to converge on some asymptotic accuracy. So this is what I showed you before, right? So this is where I thought that I was seeing qualitatively similar human-like impairments on accuracy. Here's where I increased both the data size and the learning rate. And you can see on the right-hand column for the spatial configuration, that effect has gone away. It's dramatically decreased. And then in the middle, here's where I increased the learning rate, but I used the same fine-tuning data set. And there you can see that it's roughly the same as what I had originally, if not worse. Let's be more quantitative about this. Here's a different graph with other numbers. Right, so here's what I'm showing you, the fine-tuning data set, but the increased learning rate. You can see that actually the accuracy's gone down, so it's gotten worse when you do it that way. right? So it seems to be overfitting. And in fact, it's the augmenting the data, making a bunch more of examples for different set sizes that helps it do better. Okay, so what does this all mean? So for artificial intelligence, it does seem that translational invariance is still an issue. And what that means, right, is you can, if you translate the image around that you're trying to classify, you would see some effect on accuracy, right? If you're trying to discriminate dogs versus cats, it matters where your cat is in the image. And people are well aware of this. Machine learning people will be like, oh, we already have solutions for that. We have spatial transformer or dynamic routing, which is supposed to recognize parts of an object to help you do a better job of classifying it. But I think this raises a question of maybe a good baseline, a good baseline that might be competitive with this is just doing a bunch of data augmentation. And for neuroscience, there's actually good reason to think that this is kind of what the brain does when we're training the visual system, right? So Linda Smith is at University of Indiana. And their group, they basically strap a GoPro on babies and then record everything that the babies see for the first few months of life. And you see something like this. So the baby, we'll see, there's this long tail of what objects it sees. So there's 3 objects it sees over and over again, like mommy, daddy, sippy cup. But it sees sippy cup from every possible angle. So sippy cup in front of my face, sippy cup in the diaper room, in the diaper bag across the room, right? So basically the visual system training itself is bootstrapping and augmenting the data in this way, it seems like. So, and also the visual system probably has other mechanisms to enable translational invariance, right? I can just move my eyes around so that the thing I'm trying to classify is right in the middle of my visual field where it's high resolution. So I don't have to be good at distinguishing or identifying objects all over the visual field. And then sort of as a last take home, I think this hammers home that it's going to be hard to compare these deep learning models in particular with the behavior of humans and other animals when they're doing these tasks where we specifically try to say, like, what impairs their performance. But this is a lot of tasks in neuroscience and psychology. So we need to be able to do this. We need to know, like, is this a good model or did I just do a bad job of training it? So things that I left out, I tried to replicate this recurrent attention model. It's Thrillington. You can pip install Thrillington if you want. If you want to know why it's called that, go to my GitHub. It's about Paul McCartney, which, as we all know, is the best Beatle. I'll take no questions about that. Also, I wanted to talk about Nengo models, which they have sort of this alternative approach using what they would call cognitive spiking models. They're trying to do large-scale brain modeling where the model actually does something, right? We're not just modeling all of the neurons. So definitely check out their approach. They've done some really amazing stuff. They can take a deep learning model and translate it to spiking models and then have it be much more energy efficient. And if you like this kind of work, check out Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference. There's a lot of people in this space trying to do the same thing. A couple of podcasts like Brain Inspired and Unsupervised Thinking. I just stole all my ideas from them. So yeah, that's what I got. Questions about that if we have time? Thank you. Saw a hand.
So you're talking about 2 competing interpretations of how what's actually going on in the visual system, and what I heard was that you're testing one of those, but not the other.
Yeah, for sure. So right, and it's hard to introduce this work without explaining those 2 competing models. But again, like for my purposes, I just care about is the behavior I see from a thing that we call a brain model, does it behave the same way as we know humans behave? So I'm not trying to resolve the argument of which of those 2 proposed mechanisms is the right one. I just care more about the fact that the behavior is consistent. I think that resolving that dispute is important and hard. Surprisingly, we've done a lot of work, but we really don't have a good idea of how the brain goes from the lower level representation up to some semantic space. Right. So I think you have to get at that to resolve that dispute.
Well, and I think I want to say that testing the other one's going to be difficult because you're going to need a way of scanning an environment.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like machine learning methods are not good at dealing with
Yeah, for sure. Right, like a neural network, like these kind of neural networks have no explicit representation of time, right? So you can't even really ask, like, what is the reaction time? You could try to add it in some way, but then you run into a whole question of, like, how does the brain represent time? You know, so you just solve that problem first, then you can, then you could figure it out. Other questions? Okay, sure.
So the one thing about human intelligence is that people can generalize from a very small number of examples, right?
Mhm.
They show me 1 or 2 examples, and I can basically run this task, whereas the neural network requires a lot more data, right? So just putting out a thin air here, but could it be that because human intelligence is more general, it's also less specialized, therefore less efficient? So if you build the, one model specifically for this purpose, what the neural network is,
Mhm.
it will maybe not suffer from the same degradation as human processing because it is special purpose built for the
Mhm.
task.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right, right? So you're saying, like, maybe part of the reason that humans are impaired is because they have to be able to generalize across many different tasks, and then you have to figure out, like, what is a task? But whatever, we know that humans can do this with many different stimuli, so maybe being able to generalize in that way is part of what causes the impairment in accuracy, right? So in this case, replicating the way that this was originally done, each network is trained to just discriminate one of these stimuli. And if you're thinking in terms of, like, a neural network is just a function approximator, it only has to learn one function. So maybe it's really good at learning that if you just train it the right way. And if you trained it to do this on a bunch of stimuli, it would start to show these effects. So I've tried that. I don't have it in my talk, so I shouldn't just refer to Annika data. But at least if you try to train it to do all three, then it doesn't seem to be any different, right? But still, three stimuli is not a lot of tasks compared to all the things that the brain can do. So yeah, I think that's a totally good question, and that could definitely be a source of some of this impairment in accuracy. Yeah.
How did you model foveation in the computational model?
Yeah, in the network that I use, I did not.
So
Yeah.
you just had it scan the whole thing?
Right, it's just seeing the whole image. Yeah. So you can add a fovea, and people have done this, and it does change the learned representations. But yeah, that is like an extra factor that I have thought about but haven't worked on yet. So it's a good question. Anybody else? You made it to the last talk at SciPy. Congratulations. Thank you for remaining awake and for listening.